He never raised his voice. He didn't have to. Respect was taught before a child could spell his own name. If this is the kind of story that pulls you in, power, silence, and the streets that shaped a generation, stay with us. You'll want to see where this leads. Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. Spring 1965, 9 a.m. A boy stands on 78th Street near 18th Avenue. 7 years old. His grandmother grabs his shoulder. She speaks in Sicilian dialect. The words translate, "You see nothing, you say nothing, you remember everything." Across the street, 2 men in dark suits sit outside an apartment building. They smoke cigarettes. They watch every car that passes, every face. The boy has seen them there since he could walk. His grandmother never explained who they are. She didn't need to. Inside the house, his father drinks espresso at the kitchen table. A neighbor knocks. The neighbor's voice is quiet. Urgent. Someone tried to rob Sal's store on Bay Parkway. The father nods. He doesn't call the police. He makes a phone call instead. The conversation lasts 30 seconds. By afternoon, the robbery problem is solved. The store is never touched again. This is how children learned in Bensonhurst. Not from teachers, not from textbooks. From watching, from listening, from understanding that certain rules existed before any law was written. Bensonhurst occupied roughly 2 square miles in southwestern Brooklyn. It bordered Gravesend Bay and the Atlantic Ocean. The neighborhood remained definitively Italian-American when other enclaves faded. In 1965, over 80% of residents claimed Italian heritage masses at Roman Catholic churches were sung in Italian. Storefronts on 18th Avenue, officially Cristoforo Colombo Boulevard, displayed imported products from Sicily, Calabria, Naples. Fresh mozzarella shops opened at dawn. Pizza parlors used wood-burning ovens brought from Italy. The subway connected Bensonhurst to Manhattan in the early 1900s. Families fled the crowded tenements of Little Italy for open spaces. 2 family houses lined the streets. Aluminum siding, brick facades, wrought iron gates painted white front porches with steel awnings. Small lawns featured statues of the Virgin Mary. Backyards grew tomatoes, beans, fig trees. Everyone knew everyone. Traffic lights were rare on cross streets. Taxicabs almost never cruised the area. Residents were insular, close-mouthed. Suspicious of outsiders, strangers were noticed immediately. Crime statistics told one story. Street robberies were low compared to the rest of New York City. Rapes were rare. Felony assaults dropped below citywide averages. Murder rates ran 1/3 less than the city's average. But the murders that did occur told another story. Mob-related killings accounted for most homicides in Bensonhurst. Bodies appeared in parked cars with bullet holes behind the ear. 2 corpses were found on Bath Avenue, gazing vacantly through windshields. Residents whispered the same phrase, "They just shoot themselves." Another resident explained it simply. "You mind your own business. You don't hear nothing. You don't see nothing." The neighborhood joke had a kernel of truth. The mob kept Bensonhurst safe. They only killed each other. This made the area safer for everyone else. Joseph Profazzi lived in Bensonhurst. He controlled olive oil importation from Italy. He sat on Cosa Nostra's National Commission. Joseph Colombo succeeded Profazzi as family boss. He also lived in Bensonhurst. When Frankie Yale was killed during Prohibition, his funeral procession included 38 carloads of flowers. The funeral took place in Bensonhurst. Like a Sicilian village, Cosa Nostra's shadow loomed over every block. The organization was spoken of only in whispers. Its presence was everywhere. Its name was rarely said aloud. On any given morning in 1965, a man named Anthony Gaggi drove through the streets. Gaggi was a capo regime in the Gambino crime family. He operated out of nearby Canarsie, but maintained influence in Bensonhurst. Paul Castellano, who would later become boss of the entire Gambino family, grew up at 2230 Ocean Parkway in Bensonhurst. Carlo Gambino himself, the family's most powerful boss, kept a modest house at the same address children saw these men at bakeries, at espresso bars, outside social clubs on 18th Avenue. The men wore tailored suits. They spoke quietly. They commanded respect without demanding it. A boy named Salvatore Gravano was born in Bensonhurst on March 12, 1945. His mother, Caterina, came from Sicily as a baby. His father, Giolando, jumped ship from a freighter in Canada and entered the United States illegally. The family called them Kay and Jerry. They spoke English at home unless the grandmothers visited. Sammy Gravano grew up on 78th Street near 18th Avenue. His father owned a 3-unit brick row house. The basement was rented. The second-floor apartment was rented. The family lived in the middle. Behind the house, Jerry cultivated tomatoes and beans and tended a fig tree. Kay worked as a seamstress in Manhattan's garment center. Jerry was a house painter until lead poisoning forced him to quit. They opened a small dress factory in Bensonhurst. Business went well enough to buy a summer cottage near Lake Ronkonkoma for $8,000. Sammy's education began on the streets, not in classrooms. At age 7, he learned to recognize who held power. The men sitting outside buildings weren't just neighbors, they were soldiers, watchers, enforcers. He learned to nod respectfully when passing them. He learned never to stare, never to ask questions. At age 8, he learned about omerta without knowing the word. A neighbor was beaten badly. The police came. Every adult on the block claimed they saw nothing, heard nothing, knew nothing. Sammy watched. He understood. At age 9, he learned about territory. Different gangs controlled different blocks. The Rampers operated throughout Bensonhurst. Italian youth gangs served as feeder systems for organized crime families. Boys joined gangs as early as 12. They fought other gangs from neighboring areas, the South Brooklyn Boys, the Avenue U Boys, the Sackett Street Boys. By age 10, Sammy understood the hierarchy. There were workers, truck drivers, painters, bakers. There were earners, bookies, loan sharks, numbers runners. Then there were made men. Made men answered to capos, capos answered to bosses. Everyone showed respect. The boy who sold newspapers below the 20th Avenue B line took numbers for the mob. Customers picked a number. If that number appeared in a specific place in the daily newspaper, they won. It operated like an early version of the lottery. Illegal. Profitable, omnipresent. The fruit store owner on 20th Avenue sold bootleg cigarettes. Cartons came from the mob. Prices undercut legal shops. Customers saved money. The mob made profit. The store owner stayed in business. Everyone understood the arrangement. The Vegas diner on 86th Street and 16th Avenue was known to be connected. Wiseguys ate breakfast there. Families felt safe eating there. The presence of mobsters guaranteed no trouble. Robberies didn't happen. Arguments didn't escalate. Order was maintained. Social clubs lined 18th Avenue. Storefronts with blacked-out windows. Inside, men played cards, made phone calls, conducted business. Children learned never to look through windows, never to linger near doors, never to repeat names they overheard. One social club operated across from Neil's Pizza on 20th Avenue. 2 men always sat outside. They watched the street. They knew every resident. If someone had a problem, a robbery, a threat, an injustice, these men were the ones to see, not the police. The men. In 1958, Sammy Gravano joined the Rampers at age 13. The Rampers were an Italian greaser gang. Members wore leather jackets, they slicked their hair back. They fought rival gangs with fists, chains, bats. The Rampers operated throughout Bensonhurst. Members ranged from teenagers to men in their 20s. The gang taught lessons schools never could. Lesson 1. Loyalty. A gang member never betrayed another member, not to parents, not to teachers, not to police. Loyalty was absolute. Snitches faced consequences. Lesson 2. Respect. Older members were called by title. Young members listened when elders spoke. Disrespect meant punishment. Sometimes a beating, sometimes expulsion, always swift. Lesson 3. Territory. Every gang controlled specific blocks. Crossing into rival territory without permission meant a fight. Protecting your own territory was mandatory. Weakness invited invasion. Lesson 4. Silence. When police asked questions, answers were always the same. I don't know. I didn't see anything. I wasn't there. Even if arrested, even if threatened, silence protected the group. Talking destroyed it. By age 15, Sammy had learned more about power structures than any civics class could teach. He understood how money flowed, how protection worked, how debts were collected, how disputes were settled. The lessons came from observation, from participation, from consequences. In 1960, Sammy broke a school principal's jaw during an altercation. The principal had disrespected him. In Bensonhurst, disrespect demanded response. Sammy was expelled. He never went back. His real education was already complete. Throughout the 1960s, the neighborhood functioned as a training ground. Youth gangs identified potential recruits. Those who showed toughness, loyalty, intelligence, and discretion moved up. Some became associates of crime families. Some were eventually made, inducted as full members through blood ritual. The Colombo family recruited heavily from Bensonhurst. So did the Gambino family. Young men who proved themselves in street gangs graduated to truck hijacking, to loan sharking, to bookmaking. To more serious operations, parents knew what their sons were becoming. Most accepted it. Some encouraged it. The mob provided. Jobs were scarce for working-class Italian Americans in the 1960s. Discrimination was real. The mob offered opportunity, respect, income, protection. Mothers taught their own lessons. Maria, whose family lived on 81st Street, instructed her children precisely. She never mentioned the mob by name. She didn't need to. If a man with a nice coat asks you questions, you don't remember. If you see something on the street, you didn't see it. Family business stays in the family always. Children absorbed these rules before learning multiplication tables. The code became instinct. Fathers reinforced the message differently. They told stories without conclusions. Joey's uncle had a disagreement with someone. Now, Joey's uncle is in Florida. Permanently. The lesson was clear. Disputes ended permanently. Children learned which disputes to avoid. On Sundays, families attended Mass at local Catholic churches, Saints Rosalie and Bernadette Saint Dominic. Prayers were recited, confessions were made, communion was taken. Then families returned home to multi-course meals. Antipasto pasta, meat, wine, conversation. During these meals, children listened. Adults spoke in code. Our friend is having trouble with that situation. The matter was handled. Everything is resolved. Children learned to interpret. They learned who our friend meant, what handled implied, how problems were resolved. The rules children learned were simple, direct, effective. Rule 1, see nothing. If violence occurred in your presence, your eyes were elsewhere. You were looking down, looking away. You saw nothing worth remembering. Rule 2, say nothing. Questions from outsiders, police, teachers, strangers, received one answer. I don't know. 3 words. Always true. Because you saw nothing, you knew nothing. Rule 3, respect elders. Men in the neighborhood held authority. You greeted them respectfully. You moved aside when they passed. You never interrupted when they spoke. Age demanded respect. Position demanded more. Rule 4, protect family. Blood loyalty trumped all other loyalty. Family secrets stayed secret. Family problems were handled internally. Outsiders were never involved, never. Rule 5. Keep quiet. Gossip was dangerous. Loose talk caused problems. Smart people listened more than they spoke. The smartest people spoke only when necessary. These rules weren't written. They weren't posted on classroom walls. They existed in atmosphere, in glances, in consequences. Children who followed the rules were safe, respected, protected. Children who violated the rules learned quickly, sometimes painfully. In 1965, a boy on 86th Street bragged to friends about seeing something big outside a social club. The boy was 11. His friends told their friends. Word spread. Within days, the boy's father received a visit. 2 men in suits sat in the family's living room. They spoke quietly with the father. The boy was brought downstairs. The men looked at him, said nothing, left. The boy never bragged again. He learned the cost of talking. The lesson took 5 minutes. It lasted forever. School teachers in Bensonhurst understood the dynamic. They taught reading, writing, arithmetic. They didn't ask why certain students showed bruises. They didn't question why some families lived better than others despite working modest jobs. They didn't push when students claimed ignorance about neighborhood incidents. Teachers who pushed too hard found themselves transferred, or unemployed. The neighborhood protected itself. Even schools operated within the understood system. By age 12, most Bensonhurst children understood power better than most adults elsewhere. They knew who controlled what. They knew which names mattered. They knew how to navigate complex social hierarchies. They knew when to speak and when silence was survival. They learned this from watching fathers, from listening to mothers, from observing men on street corners, from joining youth gangs, from absorbing lessons embedded in every interaction. Traditional etiquette, please, thank you, excuse me, mattered less than mafia etiquette. Traditional etiquette was for outsiders, for school, for show. Mafia etiquette was for survival, for respect, for success, for real life. Mafia etiquette had specific rules. They were taught through example, not explanation. When entering a social club, young men learned to wait at the door until acknowledged. Pushing inside was disrespectful. Disrespect was unforgivable. Someone older would nod. Only then did you enter. You greeted the senior members first, by name, with respect. Good morning, Mr. Castellano. Good afternoon, Mr. Gaggi. You never used first names with made men unless invited. You never sat without being told where to sit. You never spoke unless asked a direct question. You never asked about business. You never counted money in public view. You never showed up unannounced. You never brought strangers. When money changed hands, it happened discreetly. An envelope placed on a table, a handshake with bills palmed, a jacket pocket transaction. Children watched these exchanges. They learned the choreography of criminal commerce. When disagreements arose, they were handled privately. Arguments never occurred in public. Raised voices attracted attention. Attention brought police smart men settled disputes behind closed doors. Decisions were final. Arguments ended when the senior man spoke. His word was law. Salvatore Gravano absorbed every lesson. By his teenage years, he understood Bensonhurst's true curriculum. The neighborhood taught survival. The mob taught prosperity. The combination created soldiers. In the 1970s, Bensonhurst remained an Italian-American stronghold. Other Brooklyn neighborhoods changed demographics. Little Italy shrank. East Harlem shifted to Hispanic populations. Bensonhurst held firm. Recent arrivals from Sicily and southern Italy continued settling there. The language, culture, and code remained intact. Anthony Casso, who would become underboss of the Lucchese family, grew up in Bensonhurst. His crew would eventually be responsible for over 100 murders, making it one of the bloodiest reigns in Lucchese history. Casso learned his trade in Bensonhurst. The neighborhood shaped him as it shaped hundreds of others. Roy DeMeo, one of the most prolific killers in mob history, operated from nearby Canarsie, but recruited from Bensonhurst young men eager to prove themselves joined DeMeo's crew. Many never left. Some ended up in body parts scattered across Brooklyn. Others ended up as made men. The difference was competence, loyalty, and luck. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Bensonhurst maintained its reputation. The joke persisted. The mob kept the neighborhood safe. FBI statistics supported the claim. Property crimes remained below citywide averages. Street violence stayed low. Murder rates, while disproportionately mob-related, affected only those in the life residents accepted the trade-off. One man who grew up on Bath Avenue in the 1970s later recalled, "You watched your ass. You knew the rules, but you felt safer there than anywhere else in New York." Another Bensonhurst resident described it precisely. "They're bad people, but they're our bad people." The education system operated on two levels. Public schools taught conventional subjects. Streets taught practical survival. Children who excelled in both systems thrived. Children who ignored street lessons often didn't. By age 16, most Bensonhurst teenagers could identify every significant mob figure in the neighborhood by sight. They knew which restaurants to avoid when certain cars were parked outside. They knew which blocks were safe at all hours and which required caution. They knew who to call if real trouble arose. And it wasn't 911. In 1985, Paul Castellano was murdered outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan. John Gotti orchestrated the hit. The news reached Bensonhurst within minutes. Children heard adults discussing it in hushed tones. No one used Castellano's name. They said Big Paul. They said the boss. They said what happened. Children understood what happened. They understood the implications. They understood that power had shifted. They learned another lesson. Even bosses weren't untouchable. Even the powerful fell. Survival required constant awareness. The rules children learned extended beyond mob interactions. Bensonhurst etiquette governed all relationships. You respected shopkeepers because shopkeepers knew your family. They extended credit when times were tough. They saved special cuts of meat. They held items aside. Disrespecting a shopkeeper disrespected your family's reputation. Your father would hear about it. Consequences would follow. You respected priests because Catholicism was woven into neighborhood identity. Priests baptized babies, married couples, buried the dead. They heard confessions. They provided legitimacy to families whose income sources remained questionable. Offending a priest brought shame. Shame was intolerable. You respected women absolutely. Cursing in front of women brought immediate reprisal. Disrespecting someone's mother, sister, or daughter meant a beating. Sometimes worse. Women held family structure together. They were protected, honored, feared in their own right. Mob wives knew everything, saw everything, said nothing to outsiders, but within the family, their word carried weight. The neighborhood's influence extended beyond its borders. Bensonhurst boys who moved to other areas carried the code with them. They stood out. They commanded respect or suspicion. Depending on context, their mannerisms marked them. The way they greeted elders, the way they handled money, the way they responded to authority. The Bensonhurst education was visible to those who knew what to look for. By the 1990s, the neighborhood began changing. Federal prosecutions dismantled crime family hierarchies. RICO laws sent bosses to prison for life. Younger generations moved to Staten Island, Long Island, New Jersey. The Italian-American population declined. Chinese, Russian, Mexican, and Middle Eastern families moved in diversity replaced insularity. But the children who grew up in Bensonhurst during the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s carried their education forever. They learned lessons that couldn't be unlearned. They understood power structures, loyalty codes, and survival instincts that transcended specific circumstances. Sammy Gravano eventually became underboss of the Gambino family under John Gotti. In 1991, he broke omertà and testified against Gotti in federal court. His testimony sent Gotti to prison for life. Gravano entered witness protection. He later wrote about his Bensonhurst childhood, describing it as the foundation of everything that followed. He wrote, "You could say I came from a pretty tough neighborhood. The understatement was deliberate, typical, Bensonhurst style. The neighborhood taught children to minimize, to understate, to deflect. Tough meant dangerous. It meant controlled. It meant organized. It meant a place where certain rules mattered more than laws, where respect was currency, where silence was wisdom, where loyalty was survival. Children learned these lessons before they learned fractions. They learned to read a room before they read chapter books. They learned to calculate risk before they calculated percentages. They learned consequences before they learned civics. The education was complete by adolescence. By then, Bensonhurst children understood power, hierarchy, loyalty, silence, and respect better than most adults in mainstream America. They had learned Mafia etiquette. School etiquette was secondary, an afterthought, a formality. Because in Bensonhurst, the streets were the real classroom, the mob was the real faculty. And the curriculum was survival. The lessons remained with them. Decades later, former Bensonhurst residents still recognized each other in Florida retirement communities, in suburban New Jersey neighborhoods, in Phoenix, Las Vegas, California. They recognized the mannerisms, the phrases, the instincts. One former resident described meeting another Bensonhurst native in a Florida pizza shop. The recognition was instant, not through words, through behavior, through the way respect was shown, through the code that never fully faded. By 2000, Bensonhurst's Italian-American population had declined to less than 20%. By 2020, it fell below 10%. The social clubs closed. The old restaurants became different restaurants. The language changed. The faces changed. But for one generation, the education remained. They had learned a curriculum no school board ever approved. They had mastered subjects no textbook ever taught. They had graduated from an institution that existed in shadows, silence, and survival instinct. They had learned Mafia etiquette first, school etiquette second. Because in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, between 1950 and 1990, that was the only education that mattered.